Mahalo.
Albie Miles, Albie? No, it's all right. Thank you.
Aloha mai kako. What I wanted to do in the few minutes that I have is just directly address some of the questions that Matt and the others posed to us. And those three questions are why is the meeting of wisdoms important to our work in the classroom and as an institution? Are we adequately equipped for our students to address the inevitable impacts of climate change in Hawaii and elsewhere? And what impedes transformational change in the University of Hawaii system, and how could we do better? So what I want to do, and please excuse me from stepping off the stage, I was sitting in front of the LED light and it started to give me a bit of a headache, so I thought I'd come down here. So first I want to start off with my own definition of what a meeting of wisdoms is constituted by, and then I'll unpack that in some detail. So the way that I think about a dialogue of wisdoms, that was informed by my major professor, a man by the name of Miguel Altieri at UC Berkeley. He's an agroecologist. I'm trained in the discipline of agricultural ecology. And he framed this dialogue of wisdoms, or a meeting of wisdoms, as the study of traditional farming systems from around the world and deriving what kinds of principles from the study of traditional food and farming systems from all societies around the world, and using that empirical knowledge to help us design farming systems for the future. So I see agroecology as really a model for the dialogue of wisdoms, where it reaches into traditional farming systems from not just Hawaii, but all places around the world where indigenous people developed elegant, long-term, sustainable farming systems that we can learn from, that we can then utilize their traditional knowledge in recreating the farming systems and the food systems of the future. So I see agroecology as this model. Another way that we see the integration of traditional ecological knowledge in the modern era is really if you look at the organic food and farming industry. That's now globally an $80 billion a year industry, for better or for worse. It was derived from practitioners and academics in this meaningful dialogue, studying what their kapuna or their elders have done as practitioners, and scientists engaging with these practitioners to study their farming systems and evaluate to what extent it is enhancing or degrading environmental quality. I think the community fisheries movement here in Hawaii is also an important example of how traditional ecological knowledge and Western empiricism is in a meaningful dialogue. So in the context of the conversation about long-term ecological sustainability, I think we are in an important position here in the University of Hawaii system where we have intact practitioner knowledge and practitioner systems that we can study that can help drive our development of new types of natural resource management systems that are going to serve us in the context of accelerating climate change. I also want to talk about not just traditional ecological knowledge in Western science, but I think it's important that in this dialogue of wisdoms, we're also talking about traditional values and the integration of traditional values with Western ethics. Because we know here in Hawaii that aloha aina and malama aina is an important cultural value. We also can approach that same valuation of the natural world through Western environmental ethics. And that's one of the things that I do in my program, is I ask my students, in addition to studying traditional farming systems and looking at it from a biophysical science perspective, I ask my students what I consider to be a very important philosophical question, which is, what moral obligations do we as human society have to the natural world? Perhaps it's a very dualistic way of thinking about it, but the Western tradition tends to think about things in a dualistic way. But it's an important philosophical question that I think is aligned with traditional values in exploring what value does nature have to us beyond its use value. Does the natural world have intrinsic value? Beyond its use value, does nature have intrinsic value? And what are the implications of the valuation of nature for its intrinsic values. And how then should human society be shaped as a result of our valuing nature in these ways? So I think that's an important element of a dialogue of wisdoms, drawing upon traditional Hawaiian values, but also looking at traditional Hawaiian values from a Western ethical perspective. As an institution, I think the University of Hawaii is in this remarkable position to engage in this dialogue, where we have intact traditional practitioners and their farming systems and their fisheries systems, and we can subject them to Western empirical analysis to substantiate how well they're functioning ecologically. I don't think it detracts from traditional knowledge, but it can support the realization of how effective traditional systems have been in terms of sustainable natural resource management. So how I address this and some of these topics in my class is I teach a class on agricultural ecology. And in that class, we study traditional farming systems from different parts of the world and evaluate them in terms of what we know about how they function from the biophysical science perspective. In other classes, we look at what is the current functioning of traditional farming systems. So I draw extensively from some of Noah's work. We look at how traditional farming systems had functioned historically, and then what were some of the biophysical limits on the ability of the Hawaiian people to farm in certain parts of the Hawaiian Islands. And then I would lastly say, beyond this dialogue of wisdom that involves biophysical sciences and ethics, I think we also need to, in this meaningful dialogue, we need to be thinking about critical Hawaiian history. And the reason I mention that is because there's a key set of historical forces that fundamentally changed Hawaiian society. And I don't think that we can understand Hawaii's present and the positionality of the Hawaiian people economically, ecologically, socially, without a deep understanding of the history of Hawaii that led to the structuring of the present day. Without that information, without that knowledge on the part of our students, I feel that we are keeping them blind to a reality that fundamentally transformed the nature of Hawaiian society and environment. And so when we talk about these ideas around sustainability, we have to understand what were the historic, economic, and political forces that undermined a long-term sustainable society and rendered it into the position that it is today. Last couple things, unless I'm out of time. One more minute, okay? I'll just briefly say, are we adequately equipping our students for the inevitable impact of climate change in Hawaii and elsewhere? The short answer is no. I speak with my students, and some of my students are here today. I start the beginning of some of my classes and asking them, who in this class can explain to me the basic biophysical science behind climate change? And most of them are not fully prepared to do that. And I think many students are equally ill-informed in terms of the timeline for possible climate destabilization, and to what degree is their region or their state preparing for the inevitable impacts of climate change. And I think it offers a really important opportunity for us, and this gets into how the institution might be able to be modified in important ways, is we can integrate the study of traditional natural resource management and Western empirical sciences while preparing ourselves to address this real-world problem of climate destabilization. And so that's one of the projects that I've been in dialogue about with some of my colleagues, and that is a project that we call IKI. And that is, how can we integrate research, undergraduate education, and graduate education into addressing the real-world problem of climate change adaptation and mitigation, and building a more resilient and equitable food and farming sector for Hawaii and beyond. So I will end there and turn it over to the next speaker. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Albie. Mahalo, Albie. The concept of conflict is a really basic one in Hawaii, but really what Albie's asking from all of us is to begin with truth. And when you understand the history of Hawaii, we will get to that place of liberation. And not revolution, like my friend Pulama says, evolution. It's a time of evolution, not revolution, evolution. Thanks, Pulama. All right, we've got Aurora. Aurora, e olu olu mai. Mahalo.
Aloha, Albie, or mahalo, Albie, sorry, I'm like super nervous here. But mahalo for introducing the issue of history. And so I'm just going to give a brief introduction, and into it I've considered the questions that we are asked. And I'll begin with a story about my great-grandmother. And I apologize if I tear up again because I'm nervous. And as a graduate student, I've worked previously in the community colleges, and I was trying to figure out what do I bring today. And I think what I can bring are these stories that maybe can help us ask questions of ourselves as we have these important conversations. But 3 generations ago, my great-grandmother, Alice Na'ili Ulao Kalani Woodward, was a middle schooler, and she was at Central Middle School. And the story goes that she would help her classmates with math, but speaking in Hawaiian. And for this, she was punished by having to go weed out on the big Central Middle School lawn. And then we skip forward a few generations. My mother worked with UH Manoa for 30 years in the College of Ag, and she graduated from agronomy and soil sciences. And the legacy of UH Manoa is very tightly tied to sugar, and especially the College of Ag. And so it's kind of amazing today that we have these different conversations. For her, she was a soil chemist. If you sent soil to CTAR, she probably was part of the processing. But she was a Hawaiian on the weekends, and during the weekdays, she was a scientist. And so I was thinking about this, that we're having this conversation about the meeting of wisdoms and this integration. And it's taken time to come to this point where we can value Hawaiian knowledge as science. I don't know, I think we're still getting there. But yesterday I was doing fieldwork, and I was in Makaha. And we're working with the Board of Water Supply to better understand how climate change and biological invasion affects the watersheds. And so every day we meet our partners at the Makaha 7-Eleven. And yesterday I met a man named Lucas. And he asked my friend for a couple dollars, offered him a cigarette. And I was thinking about, while I spend all this time and money and trying to answer these research questions about how climate change and invasion are affecting our water resources, this guy is like living day to day. And how do we talk about sustainability for 10 years or 100 years in these really nice conditions when some people are thinking about day to day, week to week, and may not even have access to these conversations? So what is my kuleana as a researcher working in this university to people like Lucas who, how do I make decisions? How do I carry out my responsibilities in a way that can positively impact him? Because for me, sustainability is not about some people being sustainable, if we can't all get there. And that's the challenge with climate change. I mean, we are in this global island Earth. So with that, I'm stoked for this discussion and excited to come up with solutions, but let's not forget history and the people who may not be here to participate. And how do we think about them as we move forward?
Ui, mahalo nui. He ike kai hohonu, Aurora. Mahalo nui. It's a kako thing. It has always been. And you remind us that this morning. Mahalo nui. Noah, e olu mai oi.
Hey, mahalo, Aurora. It's a tough one to follow. I mean, that is the essence, It's just the things that we forget, and that is the most important. So anyway, thank you for sharing. I guess I wanted to zoom out a little bit, and think when I heard the kind of meeting of the wisdoms and what, to me was the big barrier there that I feel like I see in our work. And I felt that was really like we need to stop treating, indigenous knowledge kind of as low-tech. We need to get away from attaching on these superficial or kind of the generic same themes we always hear of the ahupua'a and the vai-vai and these broad stroke concepts, and recognize that indigenous wisdom is actually a very high-tech in a knowledge-intensive way. And I really appreciate Matthew bringing up that question. I know I asked, how will the world be different for the Hokulea sailing the world? And I think that's one of the things that might come from it. This recognition that these really knowledge-intensive forms are really high-tech applications. And, it's something we try to tackle in our work a little bit, to get away from just the generic concept of what you do to really the very, very specific knowledge of the practice. Just one quick example, we look at mulch in farming. And, really low-tech thing, yeah? You mulch, you put mulch on your plants, and it stops water from evaporating, and it gives nutrients, and this really low-tech, really simple thing. But when we really started digging into it, you can just mulch, or you can mulch with a specific recipe of leaves that were harvested at a very specific time, the first sign of yellowing on the plant, that were mulched to a specific depth and then added to at a specific time later and managed to be pulled back when the rains come and put them back. And just that difference between mulching and mulching with this really specific knowledge, we found an 11-fold difference in the amount of nitrogen fixation that was occurring in this practice. And I think that's the difference between thinking of these things as concepts and thinking of them as applicable technologies. That when you have that knowledge that goes with it, it becomes a concept to something that really makes a big impact. And so is an 11-fold difference in nitrogen a big deal? And there's just the paper I read the other day that followed a loaf of wheat bread from farm to table to consumption and all the greenhouse gas emissions associated with that loaf of bread. And of everything that happens, the tractors and the transportation and the processing and the storage and all of that, 43% of the entire emissions of that loaf of bread comes from nitrogen fertilizer. And so these really simple, seemingly simple concepts of mulching, if we can combine that with the really high-tech knowledge that goes with it, you could have taken a 20% slice out of that whole greenhouse gas emissions associated with that bread through a very simple, though knowledge-intensive pathway. So it's kind of one of the big points I wanted to make. Going towards the end of the panel, some of the things have been covered. But yeah, another part of our work, is just to ask, what is it we want? What is it we value? And how do we get there? And how do we measure it? And some people have already touched on that system, and it's not a new concept. People are already slamming GDP. It's not a good metric, measuring our productivity, or our jobs, like a war can make GDP go up. A sickness can make GDP go up. But what is it we really, GDP is just a measure of our ability to reach the goals that we actually want to reach. And so I think a foundation of these concepts is what is the goals we actually want to reach, which I think Aurora highlighted in a really, really powerful way. That is the goal, one goal anyway, that we all need to get there together. And so starting these conversations with that foundation of what are our values, what are we actually trying to really accomplish, is a key thing. So that will turn it over to our final
Noah, mahalo nui. I just want to say that your thoughts remind me of Pa Kukui, the whole, what we called in our ancient times, the Hamakua lands where Kala was born, Pa Kukui, so Kukui as a beloved mulch. That is something for us to dive into scientifically. Yeah, you guys? Mahalo nui no ko ike kupuna. Mahalo nui. Tim?
Hello. Well, as some of you might guess, it's kind of humbling to be up here. And I know some of my students will say, you're never humble, you can't be humble. But the fact is, it's inherent and ingrained in many ways. And the humbling aspect in particular is my incompetence to be able to really dialogue with some of the Native Hawaiian issues that I really wish I knew better because I'd lived them. But I haven't lived them. And as we looked at the reading, there was some great wording there from Dr. Herman about, yeah, but you can still contribute. And so you can still be proud. And those two words, to me, are really, really important in this conversation. And to me, they kind of, in a way, describe what I observe of Native Hawaiians. Humble, very much willing to work and exceed, but at the same time, at a point where they're not going to give their values away. And I hope we're all that way in many ways. And I know that I do take pride in being up here as well as being humble, and those are not contradictory. And I hope all of you take pride in the fact that you're here, that you've worked and you've pushed yourself to represent something and to be something and to try to be better at something. So when we talk about knowledge, this is the cornerstone to me, is humility. One of my favorite sayings that some have heard me mention is that from my English teacher back in undergraduate school, who said, the most educated person in the world is the one who can sit down with any other person anywhere, speak to them in their own language about what matters to them. That is wisdom. And we will never have it all. But what we have to do is try harder to have wisdom when we make decisions. To me, I think, and I'm here as a sustainability guy, and to me, sustainability has to be institutional. You mentioned it, I think, was it Rosie, who we can't do it one at a time. You know, we have to try to become sustainable. And that's a we, that's a collective. So when we talk specifically about knowledge and the conversation about meetings of wisdom and what we have here, there's a couple of things that come to mind for me. In the first place, locally, we understand, because it comes in front of us all the time, there's Native Hawaiian tradition that brings such a rich set of understanding and skills. And then there's the rest, I'm not sure what we call it. I mean, I'm going to call it contemporary society and act like that means something. But in my understanding, Native Hawaiian society traditionally understood that it lived on islands, that these were the resources we had, and that we cannot exceed those limits because we will undermine our very existence. And that's all very key to me to understand the value of that wisdom. And that is wisdom that goes beyond researching. It's a feeling, that's a gut, that's a heart. On the other hand, contemporary society seems to have come to a place where we are saying, oh, we've exceeded some limits, and we have to change. Now, that's the real trick, I think, in so many ways. We have to change. We can't just build a society based upon what we've been doing. We have to change. And I think anybody who looks into sustainability with some credibility understands that that's a critical thing to confront and understand in a humble fashion. So that sea change is what I think sustainability is about. In my book, sustainability is intended to reflect wisdom and to exercise wisdom and to put aside some other things that maybe aren't as wise that we've replaced wisdom with in various times. So if I get more detailed, I think one of the problems we have often led ourselves to is that we tend to break things into pieces. It's called reductionism. So our knowledge is broken into pieces, our governance is broken into pieces, our approach is broken into pieces, and we end up attacking pieces without raising ourselves back up to look at the whole. And by that, we do things well on one respect and we mess something else up and we call it an unintended consequence. And that is where most unsustainability comes from. It doesn't come from people trying to be unsustainable. It comes from they're not doing their homework. not looking at the whole picture. Now, this is what systems thinking does for us. Systems, in its first level, recognizes that knowledge, as we call it, may or may not have anything to do with the way the world works. We have categories, we have disciplines, we have titles, but the world doesn't care about that. The world does stuff. And so if we rely on our category from the beginning, we are likely to miss a vital function. So now we get to this term transformative. That was coined by early sustainability researchers, somewhat radical in the way they said, we have to be transformative with our education in order to have a chance here. Transformative is hard, transformative is humbling, transformative makes you uncomfortable and unpopular sometimes. Because it takes something that some people have necessarily when we change. But that word is upon us. And this is what I have hoped we get to talk about with this group, because we need leadership. And we need mass to be able to have the conversation with credibility. So sustainability science, which I can represent, is a methodology. But I think it is embedded in the humility of understanding that each one of us is confined by what we call our mental model. We only know so much. And research says if there's one of us, we have one set of knowledge. If there are 8 of us, we have 40 sets, because we combine and interchange. But what if we have 1,000 of us? You know, what does it take? How do we use that knowledge properly? And it includes experts. It includes folks down the road. It includes cultural people. It includes mathematicians. It includes whatever we need to work on problems. And that is what is termed in sustainability science as transdisciplinary, not just interdisciplinary, but we can't get it just from campus. We need to get off campus. We need to talk to people and understand what matters to them. So gathering of information, meeting of the wisdom, that to me is step one in terms of what we try to do with sustainability science. Secondly is how do we organize that wisdom? How do we decide which one applies to what we're doing? And there's another concept called problem-driven approach. This is the inverse of categorization. We don't give it to the transportation department or the water department or whomever. What we say is, let's define the problem. And as my students know, that means what are the questions we need to answer about this issue. Let's work on questions. We don't need answers yet, we need questions. So we develop the questions based upon what we have in order to develop a model for how we can seek answers that are more holistic. And then third of all, whenever we come up with answers, we need to be humble enough to recognize that they will probably be wrong. That we still have learning to do once we apply, and that we'll learn more once we've implemented a change. We can take another look. And often it's not that our practice was wrong, it's that our very assumption was wrong when we put this model together. So these are the sketchy parts of how can you build a model. But notice that this focuses not on the outcomes, not on the projects, not on the checklist. If we do those things ahead of time, we're assuming we're right about something. If, on the other hand, we take the problem and try to ask the questions, we have the opportunity to engage in things that we hadn't thought of. We have right now, Matt mentioned net zero as a conversation. Well, the truth is, Maui is like this far from saying we can say we're net zero. But we had another conversation about that with the chancellor and some others just last week. And we said, what does net zero mean? And, you know, the truth is, in the world, we use terms like that. We use net zero for energy. We use net zero for waste. There's no such thing in either in terms of net zero impact. So the question is, what are you trying to get to? What is it you're trying to attain? And hopefully the answer is the one that we got from a video that we saw 3 years ago from the Native Hawaiian family who was a salt mining group. And the woman was asked, what is sustainability? And she said, we just need the chance to do the best we can.